So, hello everyone. For those that don't know me, plenty of you do. I'm Max Pro. I'm Policy Director at the Australian Banking Association. Firstly, want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon for this discussion. This is actually our first episode of the ABA Future of Banking webinar series for 2025. So, very excited to kick the series off. Just before we start the discussion, I just want to begin the webinar today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. For those of us at the ABA, we are located on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Today's session will be a Q&A style discussion with Dr. Ian Oppermann, newly appointed Chair of Australia's Data Standards Body. For those that are unfamiliar with Ian's background, Ian brings nearly 3 decades of experience in the information and communications technology sector. He's held senior management roles in Europe and Australia, including Director for Radio Access Performance at Nokia, Global Head of Sales Partnering at Nokia Siemens Networks, and Divisional Chief and Flagship Director at the CSIRO. From 2015 to 2023, Ian was the New South Wales Government's Chief Data Scientist, working within the Department of Customer Service. Ian is well known for his leadership in shaping global technical standards development, with roles at the International Organisation for Standardisation, the ISO, and International Electrotechnical Commission, the IEC. Ian is also a non-executive director of Standards Australia. Ian also holds an MBA from the University of London and a PhD in telecommunications from the University of Sydney. Just a couple of points on housekeeping. Please feel free to send any questions that you may have while we have the discussion through. You don't need to wait until the end to send the questions through. And we'll aim to leave, I'm hoping at least 20 minutes at the end of the Q&A to get to as many questions from the audience as possible. And just one other thing to mention, I'm sure nobody is unaware of this, but a federal election was called a week ago. And what that means is the caretaker conventions do apply. So I'll just let Ian touch on that very briefly before we go into the first question. But Ian, did you just want to jump in and explain what that means?
Yeah, thanks very much, Max. Great to be here. I'm joining you today from the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Bunurong Boon Wurrung people lands here in Melbourne. Yeah, caretaker convention effectively means that we don't comment on policy, we don't comment on major decisions, we don't comment on things which are inherently political. So I just want to be clear that whatever I talk about today is my view and not necessarily reflective of that of government.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Ian. So let's kick things off. So first question is, what does your new role as the Data Standards Chair involve, and how do you see it influencing Australia's approach to secure and trusted digital services? And I think feel free to touch on this both across society and in the banking sector specifically. Sure.
So the role now has consumer data right and digital identity combined. And I think that's a really interesting place to be, because, of course, consumer data right effectively creates the rails for moving data about people around currently banking and energy. But identity is how you actually unlock access to those different services which are enabled. So what I'm really genuinely hoping is that with this more joined up component, we've got 2 legs of a pretty large digital economy elephant that we can start to look at. And I really am hoping that it takes out some of the friction associated with just engaging with digital in the form of digital ID, but it also means that we can start to put additional protections around consumer data right in the form of it has to be me, or I have to be able to prove that it's me before I start accessing those services.
And so I think the purpose of the discussion today more broadly is first and foremost digital ID. I think that is very much the emerging part of your role, and the part that will be, I guess, accelerating the most and getting the most expansion happening in the at least short to medium term. So I might just probe a bit about Australia's digital ID system and your thoughts on that. So your first question, so I think depending on who you ask, the concept of a digital ID is going to mean a variety of different things. It can mean it's a whole bunch of speculation, some positive, some negative, sometimes some conspiracy theories as well on it. It's can be quite a loaded term. Simply put, when you talk about digital ID, what does it encompass in your mind beyond what I think everyone understands is a simple concept of digitizing identity documents?
So principally, it's about securely, easily, and efficiently verifying that it really is me that's trying to access this service and it's not someone else. Historically, we've used multiple different points of ID with passports and driver's license and so on, multiple different physical artifacts to say this really is me. And from this point on, anything associated with this account is me. That's not necessarily a great way to engage with a rapidly moving, rapidly evolving digital economy. So a digital ID that has irrefutable ways for me to prove that this is me inside the system, and then subsequently allow me to unlock different services or allow me to verify or prove that I have the credential that I claim to have. That's really all about removing friction in a way which is provably safe. And that's the really important point. What we want from the digital economy is effectiveness, efficiency, personalization of services, different ways of doing things. But we want to be able to say that this really is me and I really do have the credentials, or that person who's claiming to be that person really is that person and they really do have the credentials. And I want to be able to do that in a way which can't be spoofed. I can't be fooled because I have a way of absolutely verifying those credentials and that identity.
And I think so. Identity plays. I've go out on a limb here, but I'd say identity probably plays a more important part in the banking system than almost any other part of the economy, and it has significant tie-in with regulation that banks are subject to. In particular, I think first and foremost, anti-money laundering legislation. So, if we sort of narrow the scope here a bit and say from the banking industry's standpoint, both what do you think are the opportunities here, and where is the value for banks to play in this space and invest and expand in this space, and what ultimately sort of why should they, with many competing priorities, where do you think digital ID should sit for them, and how should they be thinking about resource prioritization?
I'm really happy to follow your lead there, Max, where you're saying it's one of the most important areas for banks. So I'm happy to be led in this particular case. If you know your customer, if you irrefutably, unambiguously know your customer, then there's a whole lot of trust-related services that can open up. This really is this person. This is their history. This is their transaction history. This is their credit rating. There's a whole lot of things that suddenly become a whole lot easier. But that's the most important level of credentialing, if you like. This really is John Smith. This really is Jane Smith. But there are levels of ways of identifying yourself which are not quite as absolute. Just simply being able to say, I have this credential, I have this asset, I really do have the right to undertake this sort of activity. That is the tantamount to saying that there is a level of provability. Once you're in the system, there's a level of provability that allows you to start unlocking things or accessing things, which doesn't necessarily require you to re-identify that you really are John Smith because you've done it earlier. And that continuation of your identity, that persistence of your identity exists inside a system of trusted environments. So the different levels of credentials all the way up to this really is this individual person. I am who I say I am, as opposed to I am the same person that you engaged with earlier. Those degrees of scrutiny, those degrees of proof allow a lot of different services to open up. Because we already have the basis of trust, it's a whole lot easier to start then doing the next thing and the next thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think just being conscious that there are a range of those that are on the call today, they do not necessarily all that close to digital ID or even adjacent to the digital ID. I think a question I certainly get from friends when I talk about it is this idea of, well, how is this different to, and you were alluding to it, how is this different to the online verification of identity that certain banks may do already? So, for example, I can put my New South Wales driver's license number and card number when applying at certain banks, and they'll be able to verify that in the background. And so without me actually having to present the identity document at all, could you sort of just touch on where you see the key difference you sort of see between the Australia's digital identity system and then what I was just referring to, which is effectively online verification of credentials?
Yeah, so a lot of historically what we've done is try to emulate the process of the physical presentation of passport, driver's license, some other form of identity, birth certificate, marriage certificate, until you build up enough points to say this is really me. The digital equivalent of that is send in a photocopy of, send in a scan, of my passport, send in a scan of my driver's license. And those assets are still in themselves potentially spoofable, potentially fakeable. So you could create, with enough care and effort, you could create a fake driver's license. What's really important, of course, is the data associated with those elements, and ensuring that all of that, the digital content of the driver's license, the digital content of the passport, it's the combination of those data elements which really do make the difference. So in a situation where, if you already have that information unambiguously stored about me, all I have to do is prove that I am the same person that's identified in that document, as opposed to saying, absolutely, I am John Smith. If my details equate to that digital trusted asset, then I can have access to the next level of service. And the difference really is, I don't need to prove myself every single time. I can just do enough proof to match the identity requirement or the credential requirement for that next level of service that I'm seeking to access.
Beautifully expressed. I think sort of, I think sort of, as I alluded to and didn't necessarily allude to in the beginning, you have extensive experience in standard setting, both domestic and international, and obviously that is the core part of the role as chair of the DSB. Sort of might just jump to standards and how we think about that more broadly. So how do we, I think just a couple of, do you have any observations around global best practice for standard setting? And so then extending on that, how could we leverage or integrate global best practices into Australia's digital landscape? But I think key here is ensuring that we aren't needlessly or unnecessarily complicating local compliance or restricting innovation.
That's a really, really good question. So I've been involved in standards now for about 15 years, and I really am a standards nut. I love standards. I just love getting together and agreeing how we do things. The problem with that is it's a slow process, and in particularly building international consensus is a really slow process, because you have such strong cultural overlays associated with what do we even mean by this sort of thing. I was involved in a data usage standard where at almost 2 a.m, when we're getting very close to the end of the standards development process, someone asked the difference between data and information. Could answer that easily. Information and knowledge, getting a little bit shaky, and then knowledge and wisdom, and whether or not we should include wisdom in the standard. It was 2 a.m. by the time we got to the end of that conversation. I said, until we have an ISO definition or an IEC definition of wisdom, we'll just park that and we'll come back to it. The reason for telling you that, what I thought was very humorous anecdote, but everything sounds pretty amusing at 2 a.m, is that there are historical ways of developing standards, and there is a good framework of standards already out there. The future must, however, be a much more agile way of developing standards. Taking 5 years to develop a standard is not a great approach by default when you're looking at such a fast-moving world such as digital economy. And AI and data sharing are real examples where the world is moving so quickly, we have to do things differently. The world of standards in the form of ISO IEC is actually moving towards a different way of developing, something called online standards development, and also a different way of delivering. It's the smartification, let me put air quotes around that, smartification of standards, where standards are being delivered as a service and the consumer is an algorithm as opposed to giving a PDF to a person. The reason for giving you all that context, apart from making myself feel justified that I do spend lots of late nights having these conversations, is that there's no reason why we can't learn from international best and better practice in which is happening in outside of Australia. We have in Australia taken with digital identity a couple of different approaches, whether it be state-based, whether it be Commonwealth-based, whether it be digitising artefacts like driver's license. And there are a couple of big ideological differences which we need to work through. But the good thing is, if it matters, interoperability eventually happens. And we've seen that time and time again. Bluetooth works because different interpretations of different sorts of standards ultimately came together, and we mean this when we talk about a particular activity. Similarly, Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is not the standard. 802.11, IEEE 802.11 is the standards family, but Wi-Fi works because people have interpreted and agreed. So I think we can certainly learn from that. We can certainly learn from the fact that just because we have, it's not a greenfield, but we've got existing pockets of standardization and different pockets of approaches. I think that interoperability is going to be one of the hallmarks of how we move forward.
Do you think, looking at Australia and sort of relatively small market, I mean, it's sometimes probably a bit unfair to say that, but where do you think, just, I guess, conceptually the right balance is between localizing and ensuring and having sort of bespoke standards for the Australian market versus importing almost verbatim international standards? Where do you think the right balance is between those two?
It's a really good question. I'm going to give you not such a great answer. It depends. So it depends because there is the one thing that you get with this international standard is that historical process of slow consensus building. And in order for it to be finally given the stamp of a standard, a lot of people have had to agree and a lot of people have had their say. When Standards Australia looks to adopt a standard nationally, the considerations of does it fit in an Australian context? Does it fit with the laws of Australia? Privacy is always one of those interesting examples. Does it make sense, or do we need to exclude or modify, or in fact there are big chunks we can't actually accept? So the answer is it depends. And in the world of identity in Australia, there's particular sensitivities associated with the way that identity has been historically managed, and the level of societal comfort with just how much identity is held and by whom. But there are also issues around our local legislation, our local Privacy Act, the way we deal with records, the way we deal with health information. So I think, unfortunately, the answer is it depends, but there's no reason why we can't start by looking at international standards and see just how well they fit in an Australian context.
Right. And I think you were touching on that concept around trust there, and I'd want to jump to that in a moment, but just sort of circling back, you mentioned probably a couple of minutes ago now, this need for us to be agile with standards. And what do you think, or where do you see the risks if we do move too slow as a country and we're not responding quick enough? I think often what we see with technology, particularly new technology, emerging technology, is the private sector will, in absence of a standard, almost forge ahead. They're not going global markets, global companies are not going to be waiting for standards to be formed if there is a void there. So where do you, where we aren't able to move quick enough, or there isn't enough acceleration behind things, what do you think are the key risks or the key issues with that?
So I mean, that is the perennial challenge with standards. You need enough time to build consensus, but you also need to be fast enough to be relevant. And if you ask, for example, Google to wait 5 years while we develop a standard for web browsers, that's just not going to happen. And interestingly, again, taking a real world example from Standards Australia, Standards Australia have been developing alternative pathways for different sorts of standards which meet the right sets of conditions from either responding to rapidly changing technologies, or there not being an industry body there, or it being a relatively lightly or unregulated area. And there have been some really interesting examples of blood plasma product standards being developed. I struggle to say the word hemoglobin, so I try not to, but blood plasma products, and also seaweed in stock feed and the various different standards associated with that. These are clearly outside the world of banking and outside the world of energy even, but they're examples of important gaps in the market which can be met in a different way. The other element of that, so what it means is that the consensus process is deliberately modified so that there's still the right number of steps, the right number of opportunities to explore, but the long version, the long version of standards development is modified in order to be more effective. It's a bit like a one-day match versus a test match. I mean, test matches still have their place, absolutely, especially after Christmas, but a one-day can often be a far more good way to get a result quickly. I'm testing that analogy. I'm not sure it's really working, but anyway, coming back to development of standards, this agile element is really quite important. Historically, standards get developed in a sort of waterfall type of way. You work, bang, here is the draft standard. And those people who are involved in it get to see it evolve. Those people who are really paying close attention get to vote and ballot at different stages. But basically, it's a waterfall approach. Here it is. The testing of standards along the way by stakeholders who have a real interest is part of the thinking around these alternative pathways approaches. And so I think there's, again, nothing wrong with us thinking about developing standards in a more agile way, where I really do mean agile in the sense of how most organizations develop software in an agile fashion. There is always the risk of wagile, which is, of course, the worst combination of the both approaches. But I think we can think differently about that process of develop, consult, test, develop, consult, test. And that's one of the areas that I'm planning to look at more closely, especially when we start talking about combining different areas.
I mean, I must admit, I'd never even considered the fact there was a standard for seaweed in, I think, stock feed. Animal feed?
That's right.
You learn something new every day.
It's remarkable how broad the scope of standards actually are. There's a standard for secondhand goods, which I didn't know about until I heard of recently.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought that they would have been. To be honest, I think just stay on this topic for just another moment. You mentioned earlier, you were talking about convergence, and you gave that example of Wi-Fi as one that there wasn't a uniform standard. I think when we talk about, say, the digital economy in Australia, and obviously a lot of the standards to date have been from the DSB have been to do with CDR in particular, there has always been this tension, I guess, between ideas of sort of uniformity, standardization, complete prescriptiveness of the standard to get that alignment versus call it sort of flexibility or more principles-based approaches to it. Where do you sort of, I guess, see, and it doesn't necessarily need to be with CDR specifically, but where that balance is in between? And the reason I ask that question is because just going to that example about convergence, so fundamentally, is it okay if implementation, if different parties in an industry are implementing things differently, do you sort of see that as okay, and with that expectation eventually things would converge? Or do you think in the case of Australia, it does sort of need to be much more prescriptive from day one?
Again, a great question. Part of the challenge is that all businesses run differently, and it's important that when we do date, as in day, month, year, we can tell the difference with someone who's doing it month, day, year. So that sort of interoperability with a finite number of different possibilities is certainly readily achievable, as long as everyone understands that what it is we're trying to deliver with that particular attribute. The bigger challenge is that the way data is collected, the way data is processed, the systems that run in real world environments. Again, we're not starting from greenfield. So ultimately, it's how do we interpret it that's the most important. So the Wi-Fi example, I'm not sure if you've ever sat down and read the 802.11 family of standards, but it's fascinating. It started out as, if you printed it out, something which was just a few centimeters high. Over the course of years, if you printed every page of the 802.11 standard, it would probably be comparable to the height of the Himalayas, of Mount Everest. It's astoundingly complex as it has developed. So that's a very hard thing to verify, by the way. So anyone who's interested in trying it out, just give it a go and tell me how high it actually is. But it's certainly
ChatGPT, I'm sure, and
it's certainly a lot of pages. So the Wi-Fi Consortium really put time and effort into saying, we mean this, we collectively mean this. So if you like, it's a post-production standardization effort where all the different modes of operating essentially come down to, this is a set that we're going to focus on, really working hard to interoperate. This is where we agree that we will be different. And in all Wi-Fi systems, if you buy a router or if you buy a product from someone, there's a guaranteed set of functionality that you get, but they'll be able to operate or offer, we've got extra fast, or we've got extra long range, or we've got extra this, because they've decided to interpret things different and deliberately be less compatible with everybody else as a competitive differentiator. But the core set of features are all meticulously agreed on, so that every manufacturer of routers and devices and people who embed components all get exactly the same result. And again, that's relevant for standards that are really complicated. When 802.11 first came out, there was one data rate, a megabit per second. Then there was 2 megabits per second. Up until that point, everybody did it exactly the same way. The moment that some of the more sophisticated stuff came out, it was so complicated that a subset was ultimately agreed upon. But everyone can operate in those fallback modes. Every certified 802.11 device, every Wi-Fi certified device will interoperate with every other, at least in some modes of compatibility. And it's good enough that, well, we're having this conversation today because of Wi-Fi.
Very, very interesting. I've also learned a lot about Wi-Fi. I might sort of just jump to that mentioned earlier, this concept of trust, and I think it absolutely applies to both CDR and digital ID, and I would imagine even more so to digital ID, just given the hesitance that I think you mentioned people have to, naturally they have when sharing their identity. What steps do you think can be taken, whether that's through policy, technology, education, or anything else, to build trust in digital services, obviously in Australia, so consumers, I think, fundamentally are able to get over that hesitation that they often very rightfully have with sharing both their identity and their personal data?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. I lived in Finland for almost 10 years working on mobile communication systems, and there's a very, very different cultural overlay in places, the Nordics in particular, where so much of who you are is represented in the digital environment. It's also accessible by governments and other organizations, including insurance companies. My tax return used to become pre-completed, and I said yes or no to what was put in front of me. You can send an SMS to find out how much income your neighbor had last year and also how much tax they paid. It's a very, very different environment. And I see, Max, that you found it just as shocking as when I first found out that that's what happened. And they've also published the list of top earners and how much tax they paid in every major city in Finland. And it's a really interesting cultural overlay, but it leads to an unbelievably effective society, efficient society in terms of a digital environment. It's hard to imagine that ever being contemplated in Australia, let alone actually being implemented, because the cultures are so different. But trust ultimately comes down to, do you have the ways of determining or assessing, even if in shorthand, that what this system says it will do is actually being done? Do you have a way of undoing something that happened, which is a bad outcome for you in such a system? And can you challenge what's happened? And or if something goes wrong, do you have meaningful ways to remedy what's happened? So as a real example, if I put my yes to me hat on as New South Wales Government Chief Data Scientist, we had a very strong mandate that trust was not something you can ask for, but trustworthiness is something you can demonstrate. And the elements of trustworthiness were privacy, ethics, security, transparency, and inclusiveness. There was a very substantial, and all of us really carried that through into everything we were doing. We produced, for example, the New South Wales AI assurance framework, where that was really baked into, this is appropriate use of data, this is appropriate use of AI. And when there was a data breach in Service New South Wales, we actually got the head of Service New South Wales to come and talk in a public forum about what happened, and the head of cybersecurity to talk about how they responded. And then the new data strategy was released, which talked about, this is how we're going to deal with data in future. And that transparency is difficult, but really important, especially when things go wrong. So part of it really is understanding meaningfully how you would bake the primitives or the fundamentals of trustworthiness into systems and processes, and also ensure that people have the ability to challenge or a decision which has taken place, but also that, well, what happens when things go wrong? How much can you really live by that transparency mantra? So it's going to be a slow process in Australia, but I think there are elements of again what we've seen in other parts of the world, but also how we could most appropriately demonstrate truly those elements of trustworthiness.
I think that the point you make about the remedy as well is so potent. I mean, just sort of reflecting on, I had quite a few friends that had their identity obviously lost and subsequently used somewhat nefariously during that Optus data breach. And I remember very distinctly they were telling me that the frustration they had was the lack of a remedy. It was that, there didn't seem to be anything being done about it. There didn't seem to be appropriate steps taken to mitigate immediately versus sort of and that's what the media looked at, and that's where the focus of it was so much on, this is what has happened downstream after the fact versus the fact that there had been a data breach at all. And I just found that very interesting. I might sort of take a bit of a tangent now. So coming into your new role, I think it's been a month, almost a month now.
It has been a month, yes.
I thought so. The DSB, and this is obviously this isn't anything new to the people on the broadly has custody of both CDR and digital identity. I think it's quite interesting that both systems are in effect at very different stages. So CDR first went live for the first banks and the first products, I think, in the middle of 2020. So almost 5 years now since its first launch. And digital ID is the legislation only very recently passed and is still very much in a nascent stage, particularly from the federal government digital identity system. And obviously caveat with the 4 weeks you've been in the role, do you have you had any observations about the challenges, which we won't beat around the bush, that CDR has had, and from those challenges, any ideas of potential learnings or implications that you think we'll be looking to take forward to digital identity standards?
Yeah, thanks, Max. Great question. There's been no shortage of people willing to give me feedback about CDR in the 1 month I've been in the role. Some of it is very consistent, and some of it is more philosophical. So some of the areas that I think make very good sense to look at is the process that we run. And I sort of alluded to this earlier. There are, I think, better ways that we can run the process. So there are some fundamental elements which I really do support. The work today has been very transparent in terms of how things have been shown, how things have been brought to the surface. But I think the modes, the methods that have been used better suit a slightly different domain, more closely aligned with software development than it is with standards development. Now, the good thing about that, of course, is the potential exists to introduce a more agile mindset. The less good part is that it's pretty technical, and when talking about what do you get for this next set of features, or what do you get for this next part of what's being implemented, that's I think we could do a better job in terms of how we surface some of those issues. Again, the consultation process, I think there are better ways that we could look at the consultation process. The intention is good, the intention is excellent. The practice may not sit quite as well with the banking world that than it would with the software development world. So, and I also think there's likely to drive quite a big difference between the response of a technical part of someone who has to implement versus a business part of someone who has to implement. So getting more aligned with one voice when we're engaging with stakeholders, I think, is quite important. So all of that is things, elements I'm currently leading into. When I look at the energy side of things, I spend quite a bit of time thinking about energy. You mentioned the IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission. I spent a lot of late nights talking about electrotechnical standards, and in that world, there's a growing understanding of the value of data and digital in the world of energy. And so it's not to say that the people are oblivious to it, but the level of sophistication in the energy sector with regard to the value of data and digital is nowhere near as it is in the world of banking, and nowhere near as it is in, for example, the world of telecoms, where effectively both of those industries move data around, occasionally backed by physical assets, but mostly they're almost pure data businesses. And the energy sector does something else. I mean, energy is different to data, but the networks potentially have great potential uplift, great potential benefit from being more data oriented. So what I'd like to do is to make sure that what we have learned from CDR and banks really does carry across to the energy sector. And then when we start to think about the role that digital identity can play, again, in banking, once you're able to prove that I am John Smith or prove that I am Jane Smith, and then continue on with that incremental verification depending on what services you want, that conversation is really starting to become live in the world of energy. And in particular, when you need to prove enough that the energy has come from your solar panels, and you need to own that energy that comes from your solar panels in a world which has not quite got the same concept of different accounts and different services, but is moving in that direction. The ability to ensure that when you're negotiating for your particular tariff, and increasingly that's going to be done in an automated way, for you either to sell or buy energy as a prosumer in there, again, there's a certain level of credentialing that's required to be able to say, I have enough authority to actually push this price or to lower my price. And that, again, that sort of thinking is somewhat nascent in the energy sector. So I think what we have now is the opportunity to start to bring it together. And again, enough credentials or enough identity to allow services to be unlocked or appropriately accessed. And occasionally to absolutely verify that this really is John Smith, this really is Jane Smith. And apologies to anyone on the call called John or Jane Smith. I'm not picking on you. It's just I'm trying to be as generic as possible. So I think the potential is there. It does require us to have a slightly broader, slightly bluer sky vision of the future possibilities. And a lot of folks are busily doing the doing at the moment. And when you ask, what does the world of 2035 look like, or 2045, it's a little bit beyond people's current horizons of contemplation, because the task of getting the fundamentals has been quite challenging. So I think there's an opportunity to learn from what's happened to date with CDR in banking. I think there's an opportunity to ensure that we get the best possible outcome for the energy sector. And if we start to move into more sectors again, I think we could and should learn from each of those experiences. But weaving identity and verifiable credentials into the conversation has to be part of what we do. It really needs to be the equivalent, we used to say, of mobile first. Now we start talking about AI first. I think in this case, credentials first may well be a way to ensure that when we get into those environments, we do so knowing that the actors really are who they say they are. And every time we take that next step and turn on the next service or negotiate the next thing, that we're doing in a way where we know for certain that this person is who they say they are and have the right to do what they're doing.
Great great answer. I think a theme that, I mean, I know I often comes up in conversations I have with a range of banks is I guess the distribution of size of banks across Australia. So we have banks that are very, very large, potentially more than 20% of a given market, and then we have can have a very long tail of banks that will have potentially 1/10% of any relevant product market. So a challenge, I mean, that I think everyone is well aware of, has just been this this disproportionality in the case of CDR in particular, and those compliance costs for particular banks, and often it's those banks that are almost stuck in the middle, those banks that are been around for a while, have a full service of products, would run the whole gambit of what they offer their customers, which also often includes a lot of the legacy technology that is very common in the sector. Yet they don't have the size of a large bank, and they don't have the resources of a large bank, and so often the compliance programs, in particular CDR, can sometimes lead to the almost a perverse outcome where their experience is that this is actually an anti-competitive policy because they're getting hit so hard by it. So when we look at, I guess, digital identity going forward, and feel free to touch on CDR as well, how do we ensure that we are able to bring the whole industry along in a way that doesn't lead to, or doesn't exacerbate and continue those challenges that we have had today?
Another great question. I mean, this is, of course, the reality of how systems really do come to life. And it's not unique to CDR and identity. And ultimately, it comes down to how important it is for everybody to be part of the change. And in the world of identity and the world of CDR, it's really important for everyone to be part of the change. So having organisations who either can't opt in or can't be part of the conversation is a very, very difficult place to be. So making it easier is part of the answer, and that comes in a couple of different ways. So sometimes it's just easier to deal with the service. So again, if I can take New South Wales examples, one of the things that was done in New South Wales was again and again move things to an API. It just meant that this was whatever was happening behind the API socket. This is the way you engage, which means that it took a lot of the complexity out, and it meant that you had a simple, dare I say it, standard way to engage. And increasingly people know and understand how to use APIs. You do your API call. It's a increasingly normal way of doing things. And that normalization and that removing friction for some of the fundamental elements of it, I believe has to be part of the thinking going forward. What does that mean in practice? The devil is always in the detail, but increasingly saying, if these elements of what you're being asked to do, to implement, are so important, then let's explore ways to see how they could be made easier to implement. Let's explore ways that we can make the complexity disappear for you, and you can then still go on and build the rest of your system out. And that may well be a competitive differentiation, but the fundamentals are again available for everybody. And that's thinking about the highest value wins for the effort of reducing the complexity. Again, I think there's a possibility to think about that in not just in a general sense, but really think about it in the sort of specific examples, such as creating really simplified APIs or really simplified interfaces.
I feel like, and tell me if you disagree, but the theme that's come through a bit in the conversation here has been almost focusing on that minimum viable product, or that bare minimum that you need to make it work and make it interoperable before, and sort of setting that as the level before going and thinking about everything else, or thinking about sort of having something that is more complex, or in theory does a lot more things, but with it comes more complexity, more cost. Is that probably a fair way to think about it?
It probably is a fair way to think about it. And I want to definitely not stray into this is therefore the policy. But if we take the example of energy and banking, there's great opportunities for energy and banking to talk to each other in a much more rich way than currently happens. I mean, if you think about, for example, micro tariffs and micro credit as an example, it's something that could theoretically happen in real time. Can I afford to do this particular sort of thing? What is the impact? What are the financial impact of me turning on my hot water system 2 seconds earlier or later, or a microsecond earlier or later? And can I sell this 1 watt of power that I've got now or in a microsecond? So I think that there's, if we think about a future scenario, there's this great possibility for a richer relationship, and any other sector and that same richer relationship possibility starts to exponentially increase. If you've got 2 entities or 2 domains working together, then a whole lot of things can happen. If you've got 3 working together, you get n times as many things happening. If you add another one, you get something to the power of n new possibilities. So the question then is, could you really have full functionality in every single domain, interoperating with full functionality in every other domain? And the answer almost certainly is not, especially if it truly is an exponential possibility. So creating intersecting domains where services are meaningfully engaged within multiple different sectors is going to require much clearer focus on that minimum use case, that minimum complexity that you can cope with. And again, if I can just hark back to the glory days of 802.11 being developed, the moment we stepped out of those really simple, there's only one way, now there's only 2 ways, now there literally are thousands of ways of interoperating. The reality is that those in the business agreed that minimum set, and that minimum set was enough to keep the market satisfied. And the market is, I would put it to you that the market for Wi-Fi is actually pretty satisfied. But we've still seen innovation, and we've still seen new things coming. So it's probably not quite right to use the expression minimum viable product, because that has a relatively well understood meaning in the world of software development. But it might be better to say that there are areas of usage where it's important that everybody agree those parts that really drive interoperability, but there may be some less imperative to flesh out the entire use space, at least initially.
Awesome. I think we might jump to the questions now. I just realised I think the time got away from us a little bit. So first question I've got, this is from Diane. Question is, given the lead time for developing standards, what are the emerging or horizon spaces where you see a need for standards in banking and payments specifically?
That's a great question. I'm just going to offer classes of things. The most useful use cases whenever you're dealing with data are the show me use cases, the compare me use cases, the tell me when use cases, or the what just happened root cause analysis, why did that happen use case. And so I think the comparability is always a good one, and that's wonderful for driving the ability to choose. If you can compare this product with that product, this credit card with that credit card within my own portfolio of credit cards, which one should I pay off first? These are great use cases for consumers. The tell me when is another really good use case. So tell me when something bad happened. Tell me when some anomaly happened. Tell me this thing. And so I'm still definitely 1 month in. I'm still definitely getting my feet under the desk in terms of the scope of what's actually been implemented. I've been watching with curiosity from the outside up until now. Now I really need to dig in more. But those broad categories of standards or functionality really do build in terms of the value that at least consumers get out of being able to use data in a safe and appropriate way.
Next one I've got is from Catherine. So you've spoken about the importance of more agile standards development. How do you see that working in practice for mandated regimes such as CDR compared to voluntary regimes? And that example there is the AGDIS.
Yeah. So I think the principle can still apply. And as I said, one of the things I'm looking at is the processes that are currently being run. And again, there are some really good principles baked into those processes, transparency being one, and consultation at various stages being another. I'd like to formalize that a little better. And so it's clearer for It's clear of when people need to give feedback. And again, there's a very big difference between technical folks' view and business folks' view. In the world of ISO IEC standards, we actually spend time developing a consensus opinion and then putting that opinion forward. So we get a chance to argue out what we think about something before we approach it. So every national body gives a response as a national body. I think there's an opportunity, again, to think about our stakeholders and not only who we're regularly tapping for feedback, but how we would like that feedback to be given. And to do that in a way which is not onerous is important, but to do that in a way which is really reflective of, at a business level, I really care, at a technical level, I really care, reconciling those different perspectives into one bit of feedback, I think is important. The other element of the way things work at the moment is that basically everybody can give feedback. I mean, literally every Australian can give feedback, and I'm not sure how we restrict it to every Australian, but everybody gets to have feedback. So there's a potential for disproportionality of feedback. And so what I'm also looking at is how do we ensure that this is a very transparent process, because every Australian is potentially impacted by what we're talking about, but in a way which is still productive, still constructive, and is still representative. And that's a tricky balancing act. So that's something I'm looking at the moment.
And so next one I've got is from Jason. Standards development is more than a technical process. There can be significant commercial implications for different stakeholders. We sort of touching on that earlier in the context of smaller banks. What do you see the role of commercial considerations or business case type thinking when setting standards?
Another great question. I've got to say these have all been crackers. It's a really, really good point. At the risk of going back to talk about 802.11, there was a massive fight between variant A and variant B when the next big uplift in capability of that particular standard was coming out. So standards are supposed to be for the net benefit of the stakeholder community, and ultimately consumer data right, digital identity, the stakeholder communities is Australians. So that's a guiding principle. The cost of implementation is something which is a reality, especially if it's mandated. It's a reality. And the issue around, well, what value really comes from it is something which is a reasonable question to ask. So one of the things about the processes that we run is I think there is an opportunity to look at value versus implementation complexity, implementation cost, and value ultimately to what does this do towards the overarching principle that digital identity and consumer data right are meant to serve. It's always about the outcome. It should always be about the outcome. What are we trying to achieve? And if I again go back to the point of what does the world of 2035 look like? What does the world of 2045 look like? Getting much sharper on the outcomes that we want to have, and then judging the next step or weighing the next step against progress towards that 2045 outcome really has to be part of our thinking, and it needs to be done in a way which is pragmatic and done in a way which it's not an ephemeral process. It's not something which is it really needs to be grounded in, are we really making progress against that? And I don't have a better answer than that right at the moment, but I think having our goals in front of us is really an important part of what we need to do.
I think that's a great answer. I've had a few people make comments / questions about, I guess, your future, your vision for the digital identity and digital open data system. So might sort of just piggyback off a comment you made there around the world of 2035, 2045. Do you have your own view? You're obviously very cognizant that this is your view and not the government's view. But where do you see the world of 2035 and /45?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things I am doing right at the moment is working with the IEC on their view of the world of 2050. And the reason, again, for bringing up something a little tangential is that the world of 2050 is a very, very relevant framework for thinking about it's only 25 years from now. It's literally we're 25 years in to this century, another 25 years on. What does that world look like compared to what it looked like at the beginning of the century? We try to frame up some of the most important factors and then try to identify the relevance to the world of standards and then try to surface some of those assumptions. And it's really interesting if the world will look like this, or if these are possible scenarios for that future world, what must be true for that to be the case? And so we try to be quite systematic about it, thinking about major technological, societal, environmental considerations, and then come back to, and now what does it mean for electrotechnical standards? I have a pretty similar idea in mind when it comes to consumer data right, digital economy generally. And the most important element of that is a trustworthy digital society. Could we really build a world of 2035, 2045 that is a trustworthy digital society where I don't need to guess if that's a spam email? I can know, or the system can protect me from it. I might still decide to click on it, but at least I know what I'm getting myself in for. So that's a joined up, low friction, highly personalized, appropriate, safe, privacy preserving, cyber secure world has to be part of what it is we're doing. And that's not impossible, but it does require a couple of really big assumptions to become true. Taking out friction of getting into the system. So at the moment, you still have to prove that you're John Smith or Jane Smith to get your digital identity. That's a pretty big friction point. There are people in Australia that don't have a birth certificate, and that's a really big stumbling block. It's also the case that at the moment, this sector doesn't talk to this sector, doesn't talk to that sector, and there's genuine concern if they all did talk to each other, wouldn't that make me, the consumer, actually the product? So turning that system inside out, working on the fundamentals of a trustworthy digital society is really, really the model I have in mind. And ensuring that we identify the biggest assumptions in there and working towards those is going to be an overlay, at least that I'll mentally have in mind and hopefully make it more explicit. By the way, when that IEC World 2050 comes out, I'll let you know and you can have a look and give me some critical feedback.
Oh, absolutely. Happy to. Last question, I'm just taking, so apologies, this is not a specific one. I've taken a couple of the themes from the questions that we've received. So there's a few comments about emerging technologies. I've seen crypto, blockchain, AI mentioned. Where do you see, and sort of tying that back to the bigger picture around digital trust, CDR, digital ID, what do you see in terms of the interaction between the two, whether that's implications for standards, whether that's implications for how we establish trust or anything else?
Yeah, again, great question. So part of the issue about new technologies is that they can disrupt the fundamental assumptions that we build systems on. Who would have thought that quantum computing could actually lead to the end of encryption, at least the way we do it at the moment? So post-quantum encryption is something we need to think about. Who would have thought that AI could so vastly improve the ability to mimic empathy, judgment, and creativity that you could be fooled into thinking that that thing in front of you is actually your CFO, and here you go, here's $25 million. Who would have thought that that was true? So I think it's really, really important for us not to get too comfortable that the way we're doing things now is the way that we will always do things. And the ability to push out, just to imagine 10 years out or 20 years out, and what must be true for those worlds that we're looking to create, or those different possible scenarios for future world, what must be true? The moment you start to surface those assumptions and then challenge those assumptions against the capabilities of new technology, you suddenly realize that maybe we're creating a vulnerability, or at least a dependency, because we've baked this thinking in. So that's one of my favorite games to play. What would happen if, and then test whether the existing assumptions really do stack up.
Great answer. I think we are pretty much at time there, so apologies if we didn't get around to your question. There were lots of good questions there. So Ian, thank you. I really appreciate you joining us today. I know we had great attendance actually. And I think there's plenty, I know I'll no doubt be having plenty of conversations with our members in the weeks to come on this. And also, we very much acknowledge you're 4 weeks into this. So no, really do appreciate you spending the time with us today. And I know on behalf of both the ABA and our members, we're very great to have you on board, and we're very keen to be working closely with you going forward. Just a couple of, I've just been given a couple of reminders for everyone else. So just for upcoming events, including our future banking webinars, just keep an eye out on the weekly alert, or please visit the ABA website and members portal. And just a reminder to all member banks that we have our annual banking conference, which will be held at the International Convention Centre in Sydney from the 23rd to the 24th of July this year. So I think there should be more correspondence coming out on that very soon. But for those that are interested in attending, put a save the date in the diary. Cool. Right, we'll wrap that there. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your attendance today.